Hello everyone, this is Brian Kelly from Association Mavens, where you get direct access to some of the foremost thinkers and teachers in the association industry. My guest today is Wes Trochlil. Wes is the founder of Effective Database Management with more than 20 years of experience working with dozens of associations throughout the U.S. He provides a range of consulting services, from consulting on database management issues to full-scale association management system implementations. Welcome to Association Mavens, Wes.
Thanks, Brian. It's good to be here.
So I invited you here to talk a little bit about some information that you shared earlier in the year through a blog post and your email newsletter, which I thought was of real interest to folks that follow Association Mavens. And it's around this idea of an AMS implementation, which, as we know, for a lot of folks can be a huge headache, an arduous process, and it's something that I think most people kind of cringe at thinking about. So I thought it would be good to talk about what you've kind of outlined as the 5 realities of an AMS implementation. And the first of the 5 that you had on your list was that reality is always different from the plan.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about what that means to you and kind of what you think folks should be aware of with this first point?
Sure. I think it's important to keep in mind that every project should have a plan. But the reality is that as soon as we start executing the project itself, the plan is going to change. I think some military general once said that, military plan is thrown out the window as soon as you hit the ground, and that's absolutely true with any project. Again, the reality is that things change, people may change, our objectives may change as we work through the project. And so I think it's really critical that those of us involved in the project actually acknowledge that fact, that the plan we have now isn't necessarily where we'll be when we finish the plan. And by acknowledging that, that allows us some flexibility to make decisions that we may have to change later and things like that. So acknowledging that the plan and the reality will be 2 different things, I think will help people focus on success rather than we didn't do it the way we said we would.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to ask you about kind of the inspiration for this approach that you've talked about. Was there, I think you'd mentioned in something that you had a book that you read that kind of made you think a little bit about, oftentimes when we have a plan, there's a point A and a point B, and we think, all right, this is what we need to do to get to the next point, but oftentimes we zigzag back and forth across that line.
Right, and I think in the case of this one, the reality doesn't match the plan. I was referring to a book by Stuart Cross where he was talking about strategic implementing strategy, and the same thing applies there. He just had a great point, which is we put the plan down, and then when we get started, reality hits and things will change. And again, it's true in life. It's true of all of our plans through life. And as we implement our AMS. Again, we've got to acknowledge that and know that things will change and be adaptable to that.
Great. So the next one you have is mistakes will be made, and just kind of acknowledging, that plain and simple truth. Is there anything else that you'd add or expound on related to that particular point?
Yeah, I'm laughing because one of my very favorite Far Side cartoons from many years ago shows the main character, Bongo the rabbit, standing in a kitchen which is completely and utterly destroyed. And you see the silhouette from over the shoulder of the adult looking down on Bongo, and Bongo says, "Mistakes were made." And it's just, again, mistakes will be made. The plan never goes as planned, and we make the decisions we make or should be making based on the best information we have at that time. And so we have to, again, acknowledge that we make these decisions, and we may find as we implement the software that the decision we made doesn't really make sense, especially in terms of how the software actually functions, for example. And so we may say, okay, we made the decision based on how we understood the software to work at that point. As we've started to implement this, we've realized, it doesn't really help to do it that way because the software does it a different way, and we have to kind of go back on the decision and choose a different path. And again, acknowledging that is really critical, because what I've found over time in doing these kind of implementations, there's a certain personality type that gets very, very upset when the reality doesn't match the plan. And that's okay, but I want to try to nip that in the bud and say, look, these things are going to happen. And so when they do happen, we just go, oh, that wasn't good. Let's try it another way and see if we can fix it. Because ultimately, we're always looking at that final objective, which is implementing the software correctly, on time, on budget, and most importantly, that the software is actually going to improve how we do things.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the whole point of why we would like to go through that process for our association, is it's got to work. Okay, so the third point that you have is these are not life or death decisions. I think a lot of times, tensions mount, and there's a lot of stress as folks work through the process of the implementation. But this seems like an important point to realize. So, what would you say about this particular one?
Well, I work with a consultant, Alan Weiss, who this is one of his favorite points as well, is that for most of us as consultants, we're not dealing with life and death situations. Obviously, there are some exceptions to that, but in my case, I'm working with associations who are dealing with their software implementations, and the reality is that if we get it wrong here, nobody dies or World War III doesn't begin. And there are cases like that. I'm not involved with them, thank goodness. Mm-hmm. And most of us aren't involved in those kind of things. And so we, again, have to acknowledge that. If we make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. We can probably address the issue. And one of the favorite examples I like to give to my clients is, ask yourself, what's the worst thing that could happen if we do, and then fill in the blank. And very often there are only a handful of things we want to really avoid doing. One of those would be avoid sending an email to the entire membership that says something, unkind about another member or somebody else, mm-hmm. something that's embarrassing to the association. Sending an email to the entire board of directors, even if it's something kind of bad, isn't necessarily the end of the world, again, because they're the board, they know you, they understand the kind of pressures you're under, and these kind of mistakes can happen. So even that isn't the end of the world. And that's, again, what I'm trying to communicate here. If mistakes are made, we can adapt and overcome those mistakes and keep moving forward.
Yep. It's important to try and remember that one. So your fourth one that you've got is communication is essential. I think that one oftentimes is something that in all situations we often forget, even though it is kind of an obvious thing. What are some examples that you could provide for this particular point?
Well, I always like to start this point by saying that the Project Management Institute, who is the group that certifies project managers, when they talk about the essential skills for project managers, number one on their list is the ability to communicate. And for any of us who have been involved in any kind of project, but especially software projects, that the least successful project managers are not necessarily those who have poor technical skills, but actually have very poor communication skills. In other words, they tend to do things in a vacuum, and they say, do this, and they expect you, A, to understand what that means, and then B, what the ramifications are, and then C, when that is supposed to be done. There's all these kind of fill in the blanks with poor communicators. And so communication, of course, is key, because we need to understand what our objective is, what decisions we've made, who's responsible for those decisions, when those things are supposed to be implemented, and so on. And so communicating clearly throughout the project is really critical. I had a client, for example, who would send out emails twice a month on their database management. This was actually beyond implementation, mm-hmm. where it's just ongoing data management. And he would send out these emails twice a month because he just wanted the staff to know that, now that implementation is over, the database still exists, they're still using it, and they're using it effectively, and continue to communicate that just through these simple emails. And they were actually really effective, because staff, it was kind of front of mind at least twice a month that, oh yeah, there's somebody actually managing this, and we're actually doing well with it. That's
good. Okay, so the last point you have is to set clear benchmarks. What would be some examples of benchmarks, and why would an association want to do this?
Right. Well, in terms of why, the benchmarks, of course, tell us whether or not we're making progress on our plan, making progress on the project, making progress towards our goals. And so you have to have something that tells you you've made progress. With a software implementation, of course, there tends to be in our minds just kind of two goals. One is getting started, and the other is getting finished. Part of the problem with that is, in terms of the software, association management software, you're kind of never finished, because you're always making improvements or making adjustments and so on. So being finished isn't actually a very good metric at all. what you want to look for is things that show progress. And for example, those things could be getting all the data that's very disparate right now. It's all over the association, getting that all into one place. That's a easily measured objective, and we can say whether we've done it or not, and it actually does show progress because we've got data all over the place, and now we've got it in one place. That's a good example of a metric. Another one might be, and these are the kind of things you have to discuss as you start the project to say, how will we measure success or progress? So another one that's very common with my clients is we want to be able to do membership joins and renewals online, because right now we can't, or right now it's very kludgy or not very effective. And so if we're able to do that once we implement the software, well, there's a metric we can measure and say, yes, we are renewing online, yes, we're joining online. And incidentally, Brian, a great example of a metric that often isn't met is my clients will say, we want to be able to sell exhibits online or sell sponsorships online. But then when we discuss further what that involves, they actually then decide, you know what, actually it doesn't make sense to sell exhibits online because there's all kinds of special rules and needs and deals being made, and so we can't really do that. We can't automate that. Same with sponsorships. Every sponsorship is different. They've got different pieces and different values, and so we're not going to really be able to sell that online. And so it's a good example of making a decision saying, oh, I want to, as part of the plan, we want to sell exhibits and sponsorships online, and as a measurement, we'll see if we can do that. But somewhere through that process, we say, oh, that's actually not really going to work.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think also, this is a really good one because oftentimes, we may have the tendency to get fixated on that end result that we want to achieve, and kind of, rushing through different processes or, milestones within the project of the implementation, just to be like, we're done. We're so focused on just getting this done and getting through it. But it sounds like it's very wise to break it up and think of these different clear benchmarks that really help measure the progress, as well as, like you said, thinking through some of the different, is this something we really want? Is it something we really need? It further clarifies those finer details. So the one thing that I thought about related to these overall 5 realities is, obviously, I'm sure you didn't, one day wake up and say, oh, here's the 5 realities. I'm sure over a great deal of time, observations that you've made, insights that you've gleaned through being involved in this process, you've been able to kind of culminate these 5 concepts. And I'm curious, is this something that you walk into an association where they've brought you in to help them through the process, and you kind of work through, as part of what you're providing as a service, some of these key areas to really get them thinking about it right out of the gate?
Right. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. All the things we've talked about here are the things I will discuss with my clients. Again, first and foremost for me, and this gets repeated throughout the implementation, is we're looking to be successful here, but we're not going to be perfect. And again, very important to acknowledge that, because we're going to improve some things. It's conceivable, doesn't always happen, but it's conceivable that some things will actually not be as good as they were before for whatever reason. That doesn't happen frequently, but it does happen. And we have to take a look at it from the big picture or the holistic view and say, have we improved more things than things that haven't improved, or maybe even things that have taken a step back? And if we've improved more, if we've become more effective, if we're advancing the organization's mission and the staff is becoming more efficient and able to provide better customer service and so on, those are all good things. And again, we have to focus on that. Didn't go perfectly, but we certainly improved from where we were.
Yeah. Do you find like managing the expectations kind of within this framework goes a long way towards making a difference through the process, even as difficult situations and maybe some disappointing aspects of the project arise, that it really helps people, your clients, really kind of be like, okay, you know what, it's a bump in the road, but we're still doing well, and we've got this coming up. Have you found that it really makes a serious impact?
Yeah, I think Well, there's no question. I mean, one of the things, it's always nice to be able to go back and say, remember, we talked about this, this might happen, or remember, our broader concern is this, and so this particular issue we're not going to be able to address. And I would say, frankly, that 80 to 90% of the people I work with, they get that. I mean, as a simple example, I will say to a given client, I work with dozens of different software products, and none of them do what you're asking. And so that either implies it can't be done, or it's just simply too expensive to do, and therefore, what you're asking for is kind of unrealistic. And they really appreciate that perspective because, again, they don't have that. They haven't looked at dozens or used dozens of software packages like I have.
Yeah.
So they're willing to exceed the point and say, you're right. Maybe we're just asking for too much here. Now, if that's the answer every time, then obviously we have a different issue. But if we can say that when it's appropriate and when it's true, obviously, and convince the staff that, like you said, we need to focus on bigger things and not get hung up on this minor or this specific detail, then the project can be successful.
Got it. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit now and talk about the 4 key ingredients to a successful AMS implementation. I think there may be a little bit of overlap, but I still think that these 4 key ingredients are definitely worth exploring a little bit more with you. So the first one that you have on your list is to find small, quick victories.
Right.
What an example of that, or specifically what you're talking about.
Yeah, the cliche that's used that frankly I like because it makes sense is go for the low-hanging fruit. And the point here is that you want to show progress, you want to show success as quickly and as early as possible, because frankly, some of these projects are very, very large. They can take up to a year or more, and that's a long time for people to digest things. And if they don't see progress early on, then it's very easy for staff to become, disenchanted with, or somehow start to perceive this implementation negatively. And so getting that low-hanging fruit, those small, quick victories, is a nice way to be able to demonstrate to everyone involved, we are actually making progress. Good things are happening as a result of doing this. Got it.
Okay, so this kind of dovetails nicely into the next one that you've got: scream progress from the rooftops.
Right. And so we have those small, quick victories. And one of the major challenges that I see across organizations, this isn't specific to associations by any means, is that we have a tendency, because we're involved, it's the forest for the trees, because we're so deeply involved in the project ourselves, we kind of assume that everyone else knows about these victories. And so instead of telling everyone about them, we just, again, assume that everyone knows and we move on. And the problem there, of course, is that those who aren't in the forest don't know what's going on at all, much less that there are victories being accomplished. And so we've got to be really, really bold about saying, here's what has happened, here's how that is better than before. And I was actually working with a client recently with an IT team that was working to service about 75 staff in an association. And they were doing amazing things in terms of the change they were implementing and the new technology they were implementing and the benefits that was bringing to both their staff and their members. But the staff only perceived them as a problem and not bringing solutions. And part of the problem with that, part of the reason that was happening, is because the IT group was not bragging about what they were doing. They just simply weren't telling people what was happening. They were given a project to do, they would do it, and they would go on without actually saying, not only did we do it, but B, here's how it's benefited you. Right. And so at my urging, they started sending out weekly or twice monthly short e-newsletters that usually had 3 or 4 points in it, and they would say, here's what we did, here's what that changed, and then most importantly, here's how this benefits you. And that was received very well by the staff within the organization, because again, they had no idea a lot of this stuff was going on, and more importantly, they didn't understand why it would benefit them. Yeah.
Well, again, it goes back to that simple communication. It doesn't take much to communicate. It's just kind of putting the effort in to just do a little bit extra and share those progress points with people, so that they feel a part of and also understand what's going on from at least a high level perspective.
Right. And again, it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, and you've got things to do, and so just adding that to the list can feel cumbersome. but the value that that brings is tremendous. And so just making the extra effort, it doesn't take more than maybe 10 or 15 minutes to compose those kind of simple emails and notes. And they don't even have to be that dramatic in the sense of having 3 or 4 points. If you've just accomplished one really important thing, write up the email, 2 paragraphs that says, we did this, here's how things change, and here's how it benefits you, and send it out. You're not asking for cheers or anything else. You're simply communicating that success. And that goes a long way to making a project itself successful.
No, I bet. Okay. So this one's got an interesting twist. Number 3 on your list is make the tough decisions easy. So what do you have to say about that particular point?
Well, I think ultimately what I'm saying here is that with any project, there are going to be some very difficult decisions that have to be made. And what I mean by make them easy is that you need to make them, get them out there, and essentially move on. In other words, don't spend too much time worrying about it. Don't spend too much time trying to downplay it. In other words, if it's a tough decision, then it's kind of pulling the Band-Aid off the scab quickly, because the longer you linger over this issue, the more painful it's going to feel. And so if you can just say, okay, we don't have the budget for that, so we're going to have to scratch that from the list, and the discussion is done, obviously explaining yourself, but the discussion is done, then we can go on. But too often I see organizations and the leadership especially, they don't want to make anyone upset, and so they might soft pedal this, or they try to couch it in other terms instead of just being essentially blunt and saying, we can't do that right now, so let's move on. And again, people might have hurt feelings, but they'll get over that pretty quickly. If you soft pedal it, I think it just makes things worse.
Yeah. Okay, and your last one on the list is destroy the silos.
Right. This again, it comes down to both the issue of communication as well as how we manage data specifically, and the challenge that most associations have, frankly, is that too much data is siloed, either from a technology perspective, meaning they literally have the data in 2 different places, or almost as bad as the data is all in one place, but each department is responsible for key parts of data, and that information doesn't get shared. And so my favorite example, and most associations can give themselves this quiz and see whether they pass or fail, and that is to say, if I go into your association and ask, who are the speakers for your association? Who speaks at your events over the course of a year? Most people will answer, oh, the events department knows that. And if I say, who are the volunteers, meaning who serves on committees and task forces and things like that, they'll respond, oh, the executive department or some department that manages that. And if I say, who's buying products, they'll say that's in the products. Who's writing for us? Oh, that's the communications department. Right. That information should be in one place and should be accessible to everyone, so that if I ask the question, who are our speakers, we should be able to go to the database and answer that question, any staff person who's had the training to look that up. But instead, we tend to compartmentalize that. There's some reason for that, in the sense that the communication staff are the ones who are working directly with the volunteers who are writing. So it makes sense that they would know who those people are. But the problem with that is that when I, as the events coordinator, or as the membership director, or as the executive director, when I go to talk to Brian about membership, and Brian's been a writer forever, and I start talking to Brian as if he's somewhat unfamiliar with our association, that's not only embarrassing, but it's very off-putting for Brian, because he thinks, why are you talking to me this way? I've been engaged with your association for years, and you talk to me as if I don't know who you are. And I've experienced that firsthand as a volunteer, and I know it happens at a lot of associations. They just don't have a great grasp holistically of for example, who their volunteers are. And technology really allows us to do that, but it's our behavior, it's our business processes that are now getting in the way of making sure that information is well shared.
Perfect. Well, this has been great, Wes. I really appreciate talking through these different points with you. I think that they really can make an impact on an association's efforts as they go through an AMS implementation, right from the very beginning of trying to determine what kind of system they need, all the way through to the very end when we're in the final phase of getting the software up and running. So Hopefully our audience members appreciate the information I know that I have. And one last point I wanted to ask you was, is there maybe a story that you could share about a client that you've kind of walked through these various recommendations and how they benefited greatly from thinking about this? I mean, this is kind of, oftentimes we focus on the nuts and bolts. Here's what we want. Here's what we need. Here's what we can afford. Here's how much time we are going to allot to doing this. And oftentimes we forget about some of these bigger picture things that help us really improve the process and make it as smooth as possible while still anticipating issues. So I'd love to hear if you've got a story that you can quickly share.
Sure. One that comes to mind, this is actually from about 10 years ago, it was an international association with well over 100,000 individual members. And one of their big challenges was that the bulk of their membership joined just prior to the summer, because this was related to college students and international travel and so on. So it made sense. About 90% of their joins and renewals occurred basically between March and June. And so they had technology in place that wasn't very supportive of that. And the result was that they had essentially at the peak about a 6-week lag between the time one applied or renewed their membership to when they would get their new membership card. 6 weeks. So if I joined today, it'd be 6 weeks from now before I heard back from the association. And so they had a very clear objective, which was to shorten that time as much as possible. And we went through the process of selecting a new software system. And one of the decisions they made was to say, because this is so critical in terms of getting the membership piece right, we're not going to try to do anything else with the database at this time. So right away they narrowed the scope and said, we'll focus only on membership and making sure we get this piece of it right before we roll out. They wanted to do fundraising, they wanted to do events management, they wanted to do committees management, and so on. But they said, because we've got all kinds of systems in place already, it's not like we're taking a step back by focusing only on membership. And so they focused on membership. We worked through the issues that we've talked about today, where we've got this plan, this is what we're focused on. There were changes that occurred as we went through that. Some things didn't occur as quickly as they had hoped, some things didn't occur as they had expected, but the end result was that they rolled it out essentially on time, and over the course of the next 3 months discovered that their turnaround time had gone from 6 weeks to about 48 hours.
Wow.
And that was, so a massive change in terms of the customer service. They actually were able to reduce headcount in the sense of getting rid of temps who had been doing data processing, and this was all because the technology allowed them to push it online and let the customer serve themselves. And so throughout that, we found the quick victories, which was the ability just to process memberships online. When they got their first membership join, they were online. They were ecstatic because that person had paid, and they were able to ship the membership card the very next day. Again, a huge change for them. And they talked about these successes throughout their organization as the project was going, and especially once they went live, the amazing shortening of that turnaround time. And they were able to start sharing data across the organization in terms of who was joining, how they joined, what the renewal rate was, and so on.
Fantastic. All right. Well, Wes, thank you for doing the interview, and thanks to everybody for watching. Be sure to sign up today in the upper right corner of this website to be updated via email when new interviews are posted. Also, follow @BrianKellyNow on Twitter to stay on top of all things Association Mavens related. Lastly, please submit your recommendation for which Association Maven you'd like to see interviewed next. Thanks again for watching, and I look forward to bringing you more great interviews. Until next time, bye-bye.